Thank you very much, Shamia, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of the hundreds of participants here with us today. What a fantastic opportunity to talk about CPTED, and it's tremendous to share the screen with Shamia and Dr. Jerry. If I could just sort of have this as an opening slide, and we could ask ourselves the question, what sort of a world do we want to live in? And I think this wall that I took a photograph of a number of years ago says it all: encouraged, included, alive, and safe. And when you think about it, if where we are isn't safe, perhaps those other things don't matter so much. So this is how we want to feel: encouraged, included, alive, and safe. Today, I'd term it a shallow dive into the world of CPTED and antisocial behaviour. Obviously, CPTED is a very involved concept which many people have spent much of their working career dealing with. So today's just a shallow dive into the topic, but the areas I'm going to be talking about, first and foremost, what is CPTED? What is antisocial behaviour? Where does CPTED get involved in this? Implementing CPTED strategies with care, the importance of understanding the local context, some factors we need to consider before we start introducing CPTED strategies, some of the ongoing challenges we face in the world of community safety and crime prevention, and then at the end of it, basically just showing you a few photographs and talking to them in relation to some examples. So Dr. Jerry introduced some of the history of CPTED and how it came about and some of the early definitions. One of the contemporary definitions, or the contemporary definition of CPTED, comes from the International CPTED Association. And essentially, crime prevention for environmental design is a multidisciplinary approach of crime prevention that uses urban and architectural design and the management of built and natural environments. CPTED strategies aim to reduce victimisation, deter offender decisions that precede criminal acts, and build a sense of community amongst inhabitants so that they can gain territorial control of areas, reduce crime, and minimise their fear. So then, what is CPTED? Well, those of you who've studied CPTED and have been exposed to the concept before will recognise these. And essentially, and once again, a shallow dive into the concept, we're talking about territorial reinforcement, which is about essentially giving a place ownership, guardianship, showing pride and control in an area. Natural surveillance, the ability to see and be seen, but obviously the issue there we need to be aware of is not providing unwanted surveillance of vulnerable areas or activities. Access control, which is about facilitating or restricting the movement of people and vehicles over, through, and around space. And of course, all this needs to be in the context of a quality environment where the space is actively managed. And I believe it always was this way, but however now even more so, we need to consider inclusion as opposed to exclusion of people in our community. So then, what is antisocial behaviour? Well, what amounts to antisocial behaviour really does depend upon the local context and what the expected or intended behaviour is at a location. There's elements of what the local culture will dictate as to what is expected or undesired behaviour, and also the law has a role to play. It can actually include behaviours that amount to substantive offences against local laws, but that's not necessarily so. One consideration when looking at the concept of antisocial behaviour is the negative impact on the legitimate users of that particular space. They're the people for which that space was designed, intended, constructed, and should be used. Another factor is, I'd call it the eye of the beholder, because certainly those of us who have been involved in government and police, sometimes people make complaints about certain behaviours it's sort of a way to exert control over individuals or groups. So sometimes what I perceive as a certain sort of behaviour, others may not perceive that as a particular problem. And I suppose it really depends, as always with CPTED, the actual context and the effect that people are actually having. Now, some of these behaviours can include, and this is certainly not limited, offences against the person, from the relatively minor to the most extreme, vandalism or offences against property, graffiti, that is the unauthorised or unlawful graffiti as opposed to legitimate and approved street art, offensive, disorderly or disruptive behaviour, and another one there, illegitimate loitering, sometimes as a precursor to committing offences. So then why CPTED? My experience has been that, there can be an emphasis on technical, that is CCTV or lighting, or an organised approach to crime prevention measures such as police and security as the solution when a community safety or crime risk is perceived. Now, certainly those strategies are very, very, very valid responses. However, one of the things we need to consider is that there is a clear understanding of what the actual problem is that we're dealing with, or is it just a symptom of a deeper problem? And of course, then we can go down the path of a problem-solving model. And many of you may be familiar with the SARA problem-solving model, which has certainly been one used for a long time in my policing experience. So we actually have to have a clear grasp of the problem. And then, having identified the problem, we need to identify which of those things from the crime prevention toolbox we're going to use in a considered way to deal with that problem. Now, with CPTED, it's an approach, in my view, to crime prevention that's often overlooked and sometimes misunderstood. But clearly, CPTED involves an understanding about how changes to the environment can encourage desired behaviour and discourage undesired behaviour. It really involves understanding how human behaviour, the actual problem or problems, the local context, very important, consultation with stakeholders and engagement with them, all comes together, and they're all vital factors. So, implementing CPTED strategies with care. In the race to eliminate undesired behaviours, make sure you don't create an environment that's counterproductive for the purpose for which it was intended, either intentionally or inadvertently, because the risk can be from perhaps not fully thought out implementation of strategies. We're actually creating a hostile environment where really nobody wants to go because they really don't feel comfortable there. So CPTED should be implemented with care. We have to consider the targeting of not targeting individuals because of their attributes, rather their actual illegitimate or unlawful behaviours committed by them. So, it's about the behaviour. It's not about the attributes of particular groups. So we need to be careful about that. The goal we should always be striving for is to enhance the desired use of the place, and that should always be the principal consideration. As I mentioned earlier, the issue of inclusion of all members of the community and all parts of the community rather than exclusion. And the International CPTED Association has a code of ethics that its members and the practitioners within the ICA subscribe to. So I'd certainly encourage you to look at the International CPTED Association website, but also have a look at the code of ethics, and that will once again reinforce what we as an organisation and what CPTED is all about. Introduced this concept a little earlier, but it's vital that we actually understand the local context, because no two locations are identical. Even facilities of identical design, for example, what occurs around them or to the users within them will be influenced by a number of things. And they can include things such as the designated purpose or purposes of the location. The location may have a number of purposes. Also, another cue or another guide or another hint to what some of the potential issues could be is what that place was previously, because we don't always have the luxury to build things from the ground up when we have some activity that we need to undertake. Quite often we need to use or modify existing facilities or locations. So what a thing was before and how it was used in that fashion may be a cue to us in terms of the future. Obviously, the people who use that space, the users or users of that space, what happens there will be influenced by that, where it's actually located and what's around it, because what the issues that impact on a location will be influenced by the bordering activities. They could be potentially conflicting uses or user groups. They could be perhaps, say, on the line of desire between sort of the nighttime economy, the nightclubs, and a public transport hub. So therefore, if you have some sort of a facility that's on that line of desire, there's a pretty good chance that the things that happen at those other places may well transfer across to your location. Another factor to consider is day versus night use. And I'll talk about a little bit later about engagement with different stakeholders, but it's really vital that we look at the use of a space or a location across the full 24/7 spectrum, and that decision makers are aware of these factors as well. So, they're looking at it from how the world operates, and those of us who've worked, say, in the police or in other similar agencies, we know the world's a different place at night time when the sun goes down. So day versus night use is consideration is very critical. There's a range of different approaches to the same issues in the world. There's the world supply, if I could use that term, of different guidelines and principles around CPTED that exist around the world. In my experience, sometimes the challenge is the crossover between guideline and legislative requirement, where the guidelines promote what we would see as best practice for a safe community outcome in relation to development or planning, but there's not specifically, in many cases, a legislative requirement to follow that through. So it really depends on the organisation and the degree of uptake and the degree of focus that they have to try and really make those guidelines bite in the absence of a legislative requirement. CPTED, as I say, is not the panacea. It's not the magic bullet to solve all crime and community safety issues. It is, however, an important part of the crime prevention jigsaw puzzle. So, as I said, it's sometimes a concept which is misunderstood, but it is an important part, and I encourage people to fully understand what CPTED is and how it can be incorporated in concert with other strategies. Remember, if you learn and understand the rules and variations of the game, in this case CPTED, if you can learn and understand the rules well enough, you can play it on any field, because CPTED is very, very much about context and the local context. Some of the factors that we need to consider, particularly in the case of antisocial behaviour, is that we can have offender behaviour, if I could call them offenders. As I said, it may not necessarily relate to actual substantive offences, but we'll call them offenders. There's a number of things that can be going on with them that need to be considered, and that is the effect of drugs, alcohol, mental health issues, which can be a disinhibitor that, otherwise they may not wish or choose to do the behaviour they would do otherwise, but for the presence of those factors. Another one is the heat of the moment, spur of the moment, incident and decision. So whilst we can plan and we can have all sorts of sound strategies, we very much need to be aware of these types of factors which can creep in. And of course, that is the lead in to say that you know, the solutions to crime and the approaches to crime prevention are many, many faceted. No one particular aspect has the answer to everything. So, you know, there's a world of partnerships and collaboration to be had in the world of crime prevention. Some of the ongoing challenges we have is the challenge we face is to continually engage with the decision makers and professional groups, because we need to encourage them to make their decisions and apply their skills and knowledge through the lens of community safety and crime prevention. And that's why ongoing engagement is crucial. Ongoing marketing of the community safety message is vital to our decision makers. We need to make CPTED and community safety an intrinsic part of the way we do business instead of an add-on. And it harks back to my comments about guidelines versus legislation. We need to maintain an engagement with and understanding of our community. You know, the community is made up of many, many facets. So we need to be aware of what is going on in our particular community. Everything is about context. We need to promote the understanding that crime prevention is not just the responsibility of the crime prevention people. Everyone has a responsibility in crime prevention. We all have a part to play, some more than others, and some more perhaps identifiable than others, but we all have a role to play. And lastly, avoid the tick in the box approach to when we're looking at community safety and crime prevention issues. Always remember the context. I'd just like now to take you through just a number of photographs that I've taken. I had a look the other day, and I think I've got something like 8,000 photographs now. So I won't show you 8,000. We don't have time, but I've just made a couple of selections here. I'd like to talk with you through over the next 4 or 5 minutes. An interesting thing about CPTED is that there's an encouragement to question everything, no matter how seemingly trivial. And when we look at the world through the eyes or the lens of community safety and crime prevention, quite often we see things that aren't actually crime issues, but they're safety issues. So here we have an example of a retrofit to a building, a facade. And part of the structure of that facade is actually a metal post, which is in the centre of the pedestrian crossing. Such a problem to the extent it actually has padding duct taped. This particular area is a nighttime economy area, black painted posts, nighttime, and people were running into the posts. So not crime, but be aware that you will find community safety issues. We need to consider in our design decisions, opportunities for crime or disorder, social disorder to exist. So out of the way places, out of sight, not controlled, retrofits to particular facilities, as is the case on the right-hand side there. What was once an open street now has a freeway flyover. So now what was once open is now actually a very constricted, narrow walkway. This is a photo. Actually, I was in Singapore running a workshop at this time last year, and Singapore is a beautiful place, but it's amazing when you look around, you find things. And in this case, near the hotel where I was staying, there was these electrical boxes. And because, think of the context, these structures provide masking of toilet activities after hours, people coming out of the nightclub. So we have a situation here where a decision is made to put in a facility, but it actually creates a problem all of its own. Okay, one of the ways to show or show what is expected in a location is through the provision of signage. But signage is far, far more than words on a board. For signage to be effective, it needs to be correctly sited, appropriately scaled, correctly oriented. It needs to be legible. It needs to be credible, because there needs to be an indicator that it will be enforced, and it needs to be capable of being understood by all. And you can see my friend, the emu there, a friend of mine sent me that photo. The emu is reading the warning sign about emus roaming the park. So the use of pictograms is one way to get the message across. Signage can facilitate wayfinding. Signage can facilitate orientation. It can indicate the direction of help. It can provide warnings, but it needs to be credible, as the top right-hand photograph there shows, that if the sign says that surveillance cameras are operating, if that's been tagged in graffitis, there's no credible deterrence in relation to that sign. Sometimes some of the old photos are the best. This is one I took in Western Queensland in Australia quite a number of years ago. And the design objective here, if you can see the arrow pointing to the rocks on the ground there, was to stop the police officers parking their cars on the grass. But effectively what it's doing, it's actually providing a tool and a weapon or a weapon for willful damage or assaults. So sometimes conscious decisions are made, but it hasn't been fully thought through. Quite often, the nature of a location will give an indicator as to what behaviour is required at that particular place. Can be places of cultural significance. Also, markings, the delineation or transition zones between public space, semi-private and private can be used to show ownership and control and give the message that people are transitioning from public space and the activities that are permitted there into the private domain. And of course, changes can exist over time. Same location, problem there with people loitering and drinking alcohol outside a bank, creating problems for the customers. And the retrofit afterwards was to open up the corner and take away the seating. So Shamia, that's the end of my presentation.